Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Ecolab's webinar titled Cockroaches, the Impact of Pests on Food Safety. Our presenter today is Dr. John Barquet. Dr. Barquet is a senior scientist at Ecolab. He has a PhD in urban entomology and leads Ecolab Pest Elimination's product evaluation and development projects, specializing in developing effective, integrated pest management programs that deliver high-quality pest protection while limiting environmental impact. He is an expert on a wide range of pest elimination techniques for food and beverage processing, food service, hospitality, and related industries. Please ask any questions throughout using the Q&A feature in the WebEx. Now I will turn it over to Dr. John Barquet.
Thank you, Melissa, and welcome everyone. Today we will be discussing the topic of cockroaches and how they impact food safety and public health. And as many of you probably know, these are very important pests in the food industry, and they pose a significant risk to food safety and public health. Okay, our agenda for today, we will be reviewing cockroach biology and behavior, and we'll discuss ways to prevent cockroaches from entering your facility. That'll also include the responsibilities of your crew as well as your pest management provider. Then we will review seasonality of pests and what you can expect to see coming here in the fall. And then learn how to select a good pest service provider. And then we'll wrap up with questions and answers. So let's start by briefly reviewing biology and behavior of cockroaches. Now, they are considered public health pests, and the major danger that cockroaches pose is transmissions of pathogens through their activities, which we'll go through. These pathogens include those that can cause foodborne illness, such as Salmonella and E. coli 0157. Their feeding and movement activities can damage food, supplies, and facilities, and we'll go through examples of that. And their activity and their fecal droppings can contaminate food and food preparation surfaces, and equipment. So in terms of the business impact of how cockroaches can affect food service facilities and their reputation in particular, everyone is an inspector today visiting a restaurant. News can spread quickly through social media, generating negative publicity and affecting your brand reputation. They generate staff and customer complaints, and there may be compensation claims in terms of comping meals for customers that complain about seeing cockroaches within your facility. Reduction in trust, and that also means a decrease in your guest traffic. And all of this can ultimately affect a restaurant's brand and reputation. Let's learn a little bit about cockroach biology and behavior. Cockroaches are prevalent year-round, especially the indoor cockroach, the German cockroach, which we'll cover in detail. But there are, just to put it in perspective, over 3,500 species of cockroaches worldwide, and we've got around 77 total species that are prevalent in the U.S., and only a handful of these do we actually consider to be pests. They tend to be poor flyers and have really adapted over the millions of years to rely more on crawling and running. Cockroaches lack social behavior, as it's called, meaning that they do not make nests or share food. They do, however, possess pheromones. For example, they possess pheromones that cause them to aggregate and get into groups in the same areas. They tend to shy away from light, so they're most active at night, and they eat a wide variety of food, so most species are omnivorous. Now, here are the two most common cockroaches that we often deal with, and you may have experienced other species. There are several that we consider to be pests. There are two species that we consider to be domestic, and one shown here is the German cockroach. It is by far the most common cockroach in food service facilities. Another one that we're really not going to cover too much today, but you may see from time to time, is called the brown-banded cockroach. And that's also domestic. It absolutely requires the food, the water, harborage that people provide. So you won't find the domestic species outside. But the brown banded tends to be more of a residential pest. So here we're going to just focus on the German cockroach, which is the #1 in food service. These two photos represent the most common species that we're dealing with, and the German cockroach is the one that really requires the presence of people for survival, whereas the cockroach on the right, called the American cockroach, it also has a nickname, palmetto bugs. In the South, I guess we don't want to scare away the tourists, but it's a paradomestic species that can survive without humans, but it does take advantage of our urban dwellings and establishments in terms of finding food, water, and shelter. Very common in the southern tier of the U.S. We do have them in the northern parts of the United States, but they seem to be restricted to areas that are very hot and humid indoors. Cockroaches are one of the most adaptable and successful insect groups. They've been able to survive many changing environments for many millions of years. And that's one reason why they can be found in a wide variety of environments. And this is why we must be persistent in conducting inspection indoors, such as kitchens, outdoors, landscapes, sewers, and in some cases roof areas, vent stacks, places like this. This should be largely the responsibility of your pest management provider. Okay, the German cockroach is most common and will be found mainly on the interior. You're not going to really find this outdoors, maybe in a dumpster area or a place like that, but pretty restricted and very commonly found in the kitchens, but they can also get into the dining areas where there's risk of your guests encountering them. They will inhabit food processing, water and harborage areas, including but not limited to equipment, lockers, restrooms, and employee break rooms, etc. An adult will be approximately 3/4 to 1 inch long, light brown, and tan in color, and it has two very, very distinguished longitudinal stripes or racing stripes on the pronotum, which is the area just behind the head. They're opportunistic feeders and will eat almost anything, and they need to be located near a water source to survive and reproduce. Interesting fact is that they can live as long as a week without water and a month without food, but typically they've got plenty of both in their environments within food service facilities. The American cockroach can be found on the interior or exterior of a facility, but usually prefers to be outside. It will enter into structures, though, around from the perimeter of the building. They inhabit large commercial buildings, including food processing facilities and bakeries. They are usually found in areas that are both warm and humid. It's a very tropical insect. So in food storage, food preparation areas, basement areas, very common here in Minnesota where it's cold, but they'll be in buildings with steam tunnels that are especially suitable for them. They feed on many types of food, but are fond of fermenting food. They're approximately 2.5 to 3.25 inches long, so they are the largest pest species that we deal with here in North America and largely around the world as well. They're brown in color, and there's species that are related to them very much down in the south, a variety of large cockroaches, but they're all very similar in biology and habits. They're all weak flyers and have the nickname palmetto bug, as we talked about. And an adult female can produce an average of 150 young in her lifetime. But that's much lower than what we see with the German cockroach, which has the highest reproduction capability of any of the pest species that we deal with. So just covering off on the life cycle of cockroaches, they go through a process known as simple or gradual metamorphosis. And this means that the smaller nymphs that you can see up at the top there resemble the adults, but they lack wings. And then the process starts with the egg capsule. They're on the left, also called an ootheca. And out of the egg capsule, the nymphs will hatch out. For the German cockroach, there's going to be 36 to 48 of these nymphs per capsule. And then the nymphs progress through 6 stages, and they're molting as they get larger. And then you'll see them here in the diagram all the way up to 6 instars, as we call them. Once becoming an adult, the male will tend to be more slender, and the female will have a wider abdomen to accommodate the egg capsule. The adult on the left is a gravid female. Basically a pregnant female, which means that she's carrying an egg capsule. And they carry these around to protect the young, and then they will drop them when they're ready to hatch, and the nymphs are going to hatch out. Your pest service provider should be aware of all the stages so you can recognize a problem when inspecting or working in a food service or food processing facility. Now let's talk about their foraging behavior. If food and water are plentiful, and they usually are in food service environments, German cockroaches will stay in nearby harborages. They won't wander too far from them. But if the food and water is scarce, then they may forage for long distances. This tends to happen mostly at night when the facility is dark and human activity is minimal. Adult males tend to be the most mobile stage, and this is because they're in search of females. And then the largest of the nymphs tend to be the next most mobile stage that will move around the most. Small nymphs, they're really going to be the least mobile stage, and they tend to stay very close to their hatching areas. And an interesting fact here is small nymphs have a natural mortality rate of around 50% per week, and that's a good thing, and it's due to their lack of mobility and learning. Actually, cockroaches do learn their environments, and the small nymphs are at least capable of doing this and in terms of searching for food and water. And then the gravid females or pregnant females with fully developed egg capsules will remove themselves from the colony, and they will harbor away until the egg case hatches. And this is an adaptive behavior that likely protects the nymphs from cannibalization after they hatch out of the egg capsule. So this foraging behavior, obviously they're walking around, and cockroaches are going to season every surface they walk on with whatever they picked up in their harborage areas, and they do breed and feed in very unsanitary conditions. So let's take a look at the foot here. It's also called the tarsus. Technically, it's the tarsus of the cockroach, and what we're looking at here is the tarsal claw. And we're getting up close and personal here. These are pictures taken with our scanning electron microscope. And it's magnified this time at 300 times, but let's move in a little closer to the end of that claw. Now we're at 2,000 times magnification and begin to see some debris on the end of the tarsus. And let's move in even closer. And now what we can see are bacterial rods on the end of that foot. And this is something we can't identify what those bacteria are. That requires microbiological techniques, but you can see quite clearly that this shows the ability of cockroaches to move microorganisms and potentially pathogens around, contaminating food and food contact surfaces. So now let's talk about the solutions for cockroaches, how to prevent them from becoming a problem at restaurants and other facilities. So, before we get into the details here, I just want to talk about integrated pest management. You've probably heard this term thrown around, IPM for short. And there is no formal agreement on the definition of IPM. That is based in science, but the National Pest Management Association definition broadly represents the industry definition. And that would be IPM is a decision-making process that anticipates and prevents pest activity and infestation by combining several techniques or materials to achieve long-term management, such as structural repair, maintenance, biological, and mechanical control. Under the process, an IPM technician conducts monitoring pests and identifies the conditions that are conducive to these pests. The technicians take responsibility, and then they're going to be targeting areas to control them and to prevent them. So IPM is basically a combination of approaches, chemical and non-chemical, that get the problem taken care of. So you can see from a graphic here that basically anything from communication, sanitation, and structural repair are very important. So it is a partnership, monitoring, and then mechanical and biological control. So in terms of completely eliminating cockroaches, we can do this. It is possible to do this from a facility, but we must follow a consistent protocol every time. And Ecolab's cockroach protocol consists of 4 science-based steps, which include residual. And the residual is applied as a wet spray into cracks and crevices, and it remains effective after it dries. And then we've got a flushing step that moves the cockroaches over that wet residual. Provided that they contact that wet residual, we get 100% kill that way. The most long-lasting material we can use is dust. and we want to be able to apply dust in as many cracks and crevices, likely harborage areas, so that we can render those areas uninhabitable. And then for more sensitive locations, we'll use bait. So this would be used around electronic equipment, processing equipment, where we don't want any of the other sprays, dust, et cetera, to contaminate those items. So pest control and prevention must be a partnership. There's things that we need to work on together to be making sure that we're getting to that elimination phase. So your pest management partner will inspect for conducive conditions and make recommendations to correct them. So these include prevention, and that's inspecting for incoming items for cockroaches. So when you're getting deliveries, cockroaches are great hitchhikers, and they can come in with items that are coming in the back door for deliveries, and then you're storing them in your storeroom. All these areas should be inspected for cockroaches coming into your facility. They can also come in with employees as well as with your patrons. Again, they're great hitchhikers, so we must be inspecting the employee break areas, the locker rooms if you have one, because they can come from people's homes. And then sanitation, very important. It's not really possible to get a completely beautiful spick and span restaurant like it was when it was new, because there's a lot of operation that goes on there. But we really need to strive to get it as clean as possible and get that deep cleaning done. And that can be done during the preparation before our service. It really allows time for you to do some deep cleaning before we come in and do our service. So sanitation, reduce the amount of available food and water. Exclusion, this is going to be largely for other pests such as rodents. Rodents we need to keep from coming into a building. Mouse can come in a hole the size of a dime. A rat can get in about the size of a quarter. So very small openings. They should all be sealed. It's difficult to keep smaller pests out, such as ants. So we need to be practical about it. But for the larger pests, certainly we can do that. Flying insects as well, making sure we've got good screens and such on the windows. Doors are kept shut. If you've got drive-throughs, make sure they do close automatically, or you've got some sort of air curtain over them. And then last but not least is chemicals. We do need to do insecticide application, but really if we're doing those other steps, we can reduce the amount of chemical that we need to apply. And again, I want to emphasize this is a partnership, so in order for us to be able to execute the full protocol, which is residual, flush, dust, and bait, we need the facility prepared for service. And your pest management provider will go through the directions for doing that to make sure that we're not contaminating any food or food handling services from the pest service itself. So in terms of prevention, and we'll get into that partnership, in order to prevent the cockroaches from entering the facility, we talked about inspecting incoming goods, eliminating harborage areas, food and water sources. So again, correct those structural deficiencies, improve sanitation. Cockroaches like to get into very tight cracks and crevices, so it's not just behind baseboards and places like that. It can be inside equipment and very tight cracks and crevices anywhere in the facility. And then communicating with your pest service provider, make sure that they're giving you excellent service reports and providing you with actionable guidelines. Obviously, cleaning up food that's just spilled, well, food's going to be on the floor always in these food service facilities. But are there areas where food or debris is not being cleaned up on a regular basis that could provide nutrition for pests? And then increasing employee awareness. It's good to have employees go through some sort of training so they know what their responsibilities are and habits around the facility so that they're not creating any sanitation issues. And then leverage that IPM that we talked about in the partnership with your pest management provider. And then as a reminder, in order to eliminate cockroaches completely, your pest management provider must follow a consistent protocol every time. They need to be well trained, licensed, and certified in the area, and experienced in food service. Food service is a lot different than residential settings, and especially when we start getting into food processing situations, that's where somebody needs to be very knowledgeable about the laws, the regulations, audit requirements, and all that good stuff to make sure that we're following a good food safety program. Okay, with that, make sure that you are giving us your questions on cockroaches so that we can go through those at the end. But before we get there, I just want to do a quick presentation on pest seasonality, what you can expect at the different times of year, and what pests are going to be most prevalent during these times. So Weather, in terms of temperature and precipitation, can significantly influence pest activity. As many of you are probably aware, we had a very mild winter through most of the U.S., North America last year, and that's going to be conducive to a higher pest presence this year. So it is something that we're already seeing. We're seeing an abundance of, for example, Asian cockroaches in Texas. Things that are happening because of the unusual rainfall, and again, poor Texas, we've got a hurricane probably headed towards them in the near future. So that's going to dump a lot of rain. All of this can really increase pest presence, and so it's important to understand what to expect in various parts of the country because so many of these pests, such as ticks, mosquitoes, termites, do pose serious health and property threats. So common pests include rodents. Now you're going to see this in the fall. It's going to get cooler, and they are searched in warmer environments. There's also occasional invaders, and different parts of the country have different ones. Up here in Minnesota, in the Great Lakes area, we've got Asian ladybird beetles that are very common. These are actually released by farmers in areas, especially with soybeans, to control soybean aphid and other pests. So Asian ladybird beetles are actually a great biological agent for controlling other pests. Unfortunately, the first thing that the beetles want to do when the farmers open the box is fly away. And so we've got many huge populations of these Asian ladybird beetles. They do overwinter as adults, and so they'll be coming into homes when it starts getting cooler, as well as food service facilities, anywhere where it's warm, and areas that they can identify to get into. Box elder bugs, very similar. They're very prevalent throughout the United States, and they're a little bit larger than the Asian ladybird beetle, but they're quite good at surviving over the winter inside structures, and then again they come out in the spring as adults. I want to make sure it's important that you understand, please don't crush these insects. They do produce obnoxious odors. Asian ladybird beetles will bite, just so you understand that, and they can stain as well. So just vacuuming these pests up is a good idea. Cluster flies look a lot like house flies, except they have, instead of stripes on the back, they've got some golden hairs if you were to look closely. These are actually parasites of earthworms. But so they're really not what we consider to be health pests, if you will, but they do overwinter in large numbers, coming into structures, looking for those warm cracks and crevices. And then American cockroaches, they're very prevalent in the South year-round, and that's where you'll be dealing with those the most. German cockroaches are a year-round pest, but we even do see seasonality with them, where their populations do reduce slightly over the winter months, especially in colder climates. So, and then in the winter, the common pests are still going to include the rodents, the mice, rats. They do not hibernate, so they're going to be present around, and especially trying to get into structures in the colder areas. Birds, especially for large box stores, food retail, food and beverage facilities, we will even see those come indoors, especially sparrows. We most commonly are dealing with sparrows getting inside, but on the exterior you can have grackles, you can have things like pigeons and swallows, all kinds of species that can be present around structures looking for warmth. Now, we talked about the Asian ladybird beetles. At this time, they will be inside along with the box elder bugs and the cluster flies. They will actually be in the structure, and if they do get warmed up enough, they can awaken and be a pest indoors during the winter. And then the American cockroaches, again, German cockroaches are very common during this time as well. So now let's talk about selecting a pest management provider for really the best solution that you can have in terms of partnership and eliminating pests. So these traits for your pest management provider, this is what you should look for: proper credentials, licensed and certified. If you have coverage nationally, it's nice to have a pest management provider that also has national coverage, and some of you even have global coverage. So it's good to have a pest management provider that can provide service outside of North America, if you're located in those areas. And you want them to provide consistency in terms of delivering the protocols and eliminating pests. And that's going to be key to their training. So they've got to be well-trained and experienced in food service environments, which are among the most difficult to service in eliminating pests. providing relevant inspections and then meaningful insights to you that they find from these inspections. You know, just finding a hole or a crack or a crevice doesn't mean that that's conducive to pests, so they really need to be pointing to things that are actionable for you to follow up on. And they'll provide these recommendations in a service report, but it's nice if they can also meet with you in person. Many of our services are conducted at night, so we do the best we can to communicate with you then during the day with a follow-up call. So calls should be made regularly before and after the service to make sure that the service has been provided to your satisfaction, and also to see if there's any other needs that you may have. There may be other pest issues that you're dealing with. And for many of these pests, such as flying insects and rodents, we're taking an outside-in approach, okay? So that starts on the exterior, making sure we reduce the conducive conditions on the outside, which could be standing water. It could be lighting that needs to be corrected, as well as landscaping. So you want to keep all foliage off the buildings. You want to make sure that you have enough barrier between the foliage and the building so that your pest management provider can provide an adequate inspection, install equipment such as rodent equipment when necessary, and also make sure that we don't have excess moisture. So managing that mulch and other landscape practices is really important, and you can keep 50% of the pests from even getting in by following all these directions. So again, a good trained pest management provider should be able to provide you with these recommendations. So with that, I can answer any questions that you may have, and I'll have Melissa just sort of, go through the questions, and we'll take them as they come.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Barkay. This concludes our formal remarks for today, but as Dr. Barkay mentioned, we will be moving into our Q&A session, so please continue to enter into the Q&A chat function. And we will take a look at them as they start coming in. So we do have a few in right now. The first question that we have here, John, reads, we have an organic food production facility with cockroaches. We are currently practicing our pest control in-house. What are our options knowing insecticide applications are restricted?
You're absolutely correct. Insecticide applications, along with certain chemical classes of insecticide, without getting into all the detail behind that, may not be used in an organic facility unless no other alternative is available. So you need to go through the other options and exhaust those options until you move to pesticides that are not on the National Organic Program or OMRI list, which are approved pesticides for organic facilities. And those, of course, would probably most likely include non-chemical approaches first, right? We reviewed those when we talked about IPM. So attention to those conducive conditions, the structure, sanitation, food, water, and harborage. And if I may assume that these are German cockroaches that are in the facility, then there are some insecticide products that may be used. Diatomaceous earth is an example. This is a dust that comes from diatoms, which are mined, and it is something that basically absorbs the moisture. It's a desiccant and kills the insects that way. And then you're going to want to partner with a pest management provider that does have expertise in servicing organic facilities. Basically, there has to be a pest management plan in place that fits with National Organic Program guidelines, or NOP. And there's established tiers or methods and treatments, so you have to go through those tiers and eventually get to the elimination of the pest. And you can go to products that are outside of the NOP listing, but that has to be, everything else has to be exhausted before you do that. And then once the pest has been eliminated, you go back to that organic pest service plan as originally put together.
Perfect. Thank you. The next question, I know, John, you had mentioned Texas earlier. It looks like maybe there's someone on the line from Texas. But there's a question that says, we are seeing a huge increase in Asian cockroaches in southern Texas. What can be done about these?
Yeah, there's two species that look a lot like the German cockroach, but they come from the outside. One is the Asian cockroach that you're suffering from in southern Texas and other tests down the southern states down the southern smile of the United States. The other is called the field cockroach. They look very similar, like German cockroaches, but they can fly, and they are attracted to lights at night. and they make their way inside buildings, so people do mistaken them for German cockroaches, and rightly so. They look almost exactly like a German cockroach. And there are a variety of bait and chemical options for treating around the perimeter of properties and facilities, but really due to the abundance of rainfall that we've seen over the last several weeks in southern Texas, these applications are unfortunately very short-lived, and we've got a lot of rain. I believe what's going to be predicted for the tropical storm coming in that may become a hurricane is between 12 and 20 inches of rain. So we're going to be looking at a lot more moisture, and that's going to be conducive to a wide variety of pests. So things that you can do, keeping doors and windows closed, okay, that's a no-brainer. Along with excluding entry points should help the situation. Find out where they're getting in. Also be sure, to be using sodium or yellow lighting around the exterior. And really that's to reduce attraction to the buildings at night. There's a wide variety of insects that are attracted, and some from a very long distance, to bright fluorescent bulbs. Even some LED lighting can be attractive to pests around the facility. So be sure the lighting is directed downward and not outward. And then I talked about landscape practices. That's especially important with these perimeter cockroaches, such as the Asian and the field cockroach, as well as the American and other species. So keep that mulch depth around the perimeter to no more than a few inches. I know that's hard to do, but oftentimes landscapers will just pile mulch upon mulch, and that makes it very comfortable for a wide variety of perimeter pests. And so anyway, keep your eye on the storm here that's going to be coming through, and then work with your pest management provider, because we are expecting the pests to really explode in situations like that. And that can include things like mosquitoes as well. Of course, we deal with mosquitoes, and we do have a mosquito program in North America. But for smaller properties, we wouldn't be able to eliminate the breeding sources. But we can expect really a surge in mosquitoes, maybe like salt marsh mosquitoes, but other species that are more conducive to things like Zika. We might see those populations really climb. So keep an eye on that. Remove standing water around your facility once you have the ability to do that. And then there are some things that can be done for outdoor dining for mosquitoes to be reduced. And I'm getting to that because you're going to be running into situations. Short-lived insecticides can be applied, so if you have an event that's occurring outside, we can do some things in terms of some residual applications to resting areas. There are mosquito traps that will help lure the mosquitoes away. For larger facilities such as resort properties and places that where the mosquitoes can be breeding on site, there are methods for reducing mosquito populations that we can actually go after the larvae, so we can do some prevention there. But typically, mosquitoes for smaller properties are coming from somewhere else, so we can only do treatments for the adults in those situations.
Perfect. Thank you. Another attendee has stated, it was mentioned that not all cockroaches are considered pests. What are the factors that differentiate a pest from a non-pest?
Yeah, there's a lot of species that we just don't see because they're either in the soil or they're in the woods. We do have some woods cockroaches that can be attracted to lights at night, so if you have an open window, the Pennsylvania woods cockroach, for example, which is much farther, many more states than just Pennsylvania, but it's attracted to light at night, and it's the males that fly, and they can come inside in very large numbers. So whenever a cockroach or insect is coming into your facility on a regular basis, that's what we may consider to be a pest. And we've got about 10 or so species that do that very well. They're very adapted to the human habitat for a wide variety of reasons. Now, it may come in, but it may not infest. So there's a difference between an infestation, which is what we define as where the insect or rodent or other pest is actually inside the facility and reproducing. Now that we would consider an active infestation. But occasional invaders, many of them, they come in on they may be seasonal like we talked about, but they're not actually infesting. They may be overwintering but not reproducing. So if they're in your way, if they're a nuisance pest, they're just there but they're not causing any health aspects, all of these are good reasons for calling them pests. But if they don't come into our environment and they really don't bother us, there's really nothing that we need to do about them. Spiders is a good example. Spiders are generally considered a beneficial insect, but most people don't like to have them within their homes or their facilities. Some do bite, some are poisonous, So there's good reasons to keep an eye on certain pests such as that, while they are considered to be even beneficial. Insects or spiders are considered to be beneficial. So wide variety of reasons. People have different opinions. Sometimes it's just the ick factor, and other times there is a true risk of infestation. So basically the cockroaches that come in, there's only two that generally infest indoors that we talked about, the German and the brown banded. But there are others like the American, the brown, the smoky brown, all those large species that occur in the south that come inside. They're pretty scary looking, and people don't like to have them there. So for all those reasons, people regard them as pests. Good question.
Great question. And John, in your answer there, you were speaking about infestation. So one of the questions that we got from an attendee was, what do you recommend for treatment for ant infestation?
Yeah, ants are really one of my favorite pests, and it's because they are so selfless, if you will. They a large variety of species. Some do infest indoors, and there's ones that, one very common one is called the pharaoh ant. And really, once ants get inside, we really typically like to use baits because baits are taken back to the nest and they kill the queen. With certain species like pharaoh ants, they have multiple queens, so if we spray a repellent insecticide, we may even spread the infestation. So inside, we've got baits that we've tested and we know work very well against ants, and ultimately, if they get to the nest carried by the workers, they will kill the colony over time. So baits are the best solution for ants that are infesting indoors. They can also be very good for ant species outdoors, but we've got some very aggressive species. One is called the Argentine ant, very common on the east and the west coast, and it has very large trails, and the colonies all cooperate, so there's no fighting between colonies. They all work together, and they can actually be in inch-thick trails around facilities. There are perimeter applications of insecticide that we can make for these critters that actually have transfer effect and will go to the nest. So, and these can only be applied by your pest management provider. In fact, I want to make the point, I don't think you should have anybody in your facilities, your crew, making insecticide applications. There are several states, and I'm just bringing this up so that you're aware, there are several states where we cannot make a pesticide application in a commercial facility unless you are licensed and certified. So be aware of what your state rules are around that. So I'm not recommending that you do these treatments. It's something that a pest management provider should do. There's granular baits, there's granular insecticides, there's residual sprays that can be put out. Generally, we want to be using non-repellent materials when it comes to ants, so we keep them from spreading. And you've also got the white-footed ant in Florida as well as Hawaii, and these ants do not, they don't share things. They feed each other. It's a very ancient way of feeding each other through something called trophic eggs. So baits do not work with the white-footed ant, which is a big problem in certain areas, especially the more humid areas. And there we have to rely on certain non-repellent insecticides to get rid of them. So really it's species dependent. And so your pest management provider first needs to figure out what the species is, where are they coming from, what are the conducive conditions, and where are the best areas to make applications.
Thank you. So speaking about treatment, one of the next questions that we have, and before I read it here, I just want to also encourage attendees to continue to submit Q&A. We have a couple more to take here, and then we'll close the session for today. But one of them is around treatment, and it reads, how long should you see activity after pest treatment is done at your facility?
Okay, so again, it's going to depend on the pest. So let's focus back on cockroaches. Generally, we want to try and eliminate on site if we can. That's why having a fully prepared kitchen that's done properly so that your pest management provider has access to all areas. There's no risk of contaminating food or food contact surfaces. We want to be as thorough as we can. So generally, we're working in zones, and we want to completely eliminate in that zone before moving on to another area. So there's a skill involved. There's an art behind doing this, and it does take experience. But if done correctly, and again, it depends on the size of the infestation. So if it's an extensive infestation, it may require 1 or 2 follow-up services to completely eliminate that population. So it could take a matter of between 1 and 3 weeks in a severe infestation, but if it's a small area that's infested, it could be eliminated overnight. So that's one of those it depends questions. For other pests, such as rodents, once they get inside, as long as the perimeter traps are catching them, the program is working. But it's when they start reproducing indoors that we have to get a lot more aggressive. And there we're getting into generally mass trapping. And again, this is an art. And we have to be patient when it comes to mass trapping for rodents. There's an acclimation period where it takes them a while to get used to the equipment, especially rats. And one particularly troublesome rodent is the roof rat. And the roof rat is extending its range. It's no longer just on the west coast. It's actually getting to some of the interior of the U.S., such as Arizona, those areas. So it is expanding its range. The roof rat is not only intelligent, it's a 3-dimensional pest. So it gets up into high locations, attics, rafters. If it's a food processing facility, they get up into higher areas. So very challenging, and those may take even up to a month to completely eliminate, because generally with rodents, at first you're eliminating the very young and the very dumb, and then the ones that are left are the smart ones. And we can be down to 1 or 2 alpha females or males, and they have learned the facility. Again, this is rats, they're very smart, and they are also neophobic, meaning they don't like new objects such as equipment. They'll be investigative. They're very suspicious of things, and we can't catch more than 1 rat at a time, and that's because they're very smart. There are not multiple trap catch systems yet for rats, because once they know a rat has been captured, they will completely avoid that area. Whereas for mice are very curious, and if they hear other mice in a trap, they say, "Hey Joe, what's going on in there?" And you can catch multiple mice, so they're different critters. So have to understand what you're dealing with. There's even different species of mice. Up here in Minnesota, we've got the deer mice, which are again a 3D pest, excellent climbers. And so they'll be getting into different parts of the store. So again, rely on your pest management provider to do the identification and then determine what needs to be done. And the length of extermination will depend on the pest and the severity of the infestation.
Thank you. Our next question reads, would an IGR integrated with chemicals be effective enough to interrupt the cockroach's life cycle?
Short answer for that is yes. Now, insect growth regulators, for those that don't know what those are, those actually, they're put on as a residual spray, and they can be mixed with other residuals, and they affect that life cycle that we talked about. So what happens is that last instar nymph, the biggest nymph, when it molts into an adult, it is mutated. And it's most of them are no longer capable of reproduction because their reproductive organs have been destroyed. So 85% or so of German cockroaches affected by an insect growth regulator are generally sterile. And we don't see benefits of that for months down the road. When you think about sterilizing them, the adults are still alive. They don't kill the insects outright unless you've applied a lethal residual with it. So they can survive the treatment, and then, but they're not able to reproduce. So studies done at universities, and I was involved with a study done at Purdue University years ago where in public housing we were able to reduce the population of cockroaches over the several-month period. But when you think about a food service facility, 1 cockroach is too many. We can't tolerate them for long periods of time. So if we're eliminating, which is what we need to do, we don't need to use an insect growth regulator. But if you're doing residential, maybe military housing, where you can't treat thoroughly and eliminate all the cockroaches during the services, then you can see a benefit from the use of insect growth regulators. So obviously somebody there is a little knowledgeable about pest control. So good question.
So we have another question that reads, do ultrasonic devices work against cockroaches, mice, rats, and any other pests?
Yeah, there's a variety of devices out there and gimmicks, if you will. If you go online, you can find just about anything. Ultrasonics, if they're working, and they really do produce an ultrasonic tone, they've been studied, and they've been studied pretty vigorously. Roger Gold, Texas A&M University, did many studies on ultrasonic devices against cockroaches in particular. There's also been studies done on mice and rats. Mice and rats, especially rats, will communicate somewhat with ultrasonics, but they don't travel very far. They're very short distances, and they can't really penetrate walls and things like that. So unless you really plastered the area with a lot of ultrasonic devices, we're not likely to see any effect whatsoever. In fact, Roger Gold's studies showed that they were completely ineffective, and in some cases the pests were living right inside the speakers of the devices. So in some states these are considered to be fraudulent, and you cannot buy them off the shelves. But you can get them by mail order. You can get them online. So I'm just saying it's a waste of money. They're not effective. There are sonic devices that do work for birds, for example, but we can hear those too. So certain sonic devices can be effective, but for birds, they would probably be used more in the farming community and not in the rural areas because they tend to be loud. So, but for ultrasonic devices, again, don't waste your money.
All right. We are going to take one more question here before we close today. So the last question really is about getting your opinions, Dr. Barquet, but what is your opinion on spot treatments from a pest provider? Can they be effective in restaurants?
Well, we've got somebody very knowledgeable here in pest control, more than one of you maybe. Yeah, spot treatment by definition, and it's on insecticide level, there's two general types of treatments. One's crack and crevice, and that's pretty straightforward. You're directing the insecticide into a crack or a crevice or a void, which is defined on some labels as layers between construction. The other is a spot treatment, which is 2 square feet. And it doesn't matter what the dimension of that 2 square feet is, as long as it's limited to 2 square feet. So that's considered a spot. Generally, there's no definition about how far apart these spots can be, but labels will oftentimes have a limitation on the total square footage that you can do these spot treatments. And they can be very effective, especially where you want to form a barrier where cockroaches might be coming out during the service and you want them to go over that spot of insecticide. So it is listed on the label, and each label will have exact directions that need to be followed by the pest management provider. So follow the label guidelines, follow the directions. The label is the law. And many pesticides allowed in food service, again, the label will say whether it is allowed in food handling areas or not, and then it'll define crack and crevice and or spot treatments may be allowed. Good question.
All right. Well, thank you for your time today, Dr. Barquet. We do appreciate you providing this detail on cockroaches and answering all of these great questions that we've had about different types of pests. I do also want to thank you all for attending our webinar titled Cockroaches, the Impact of Pests on Food Safety. A recording of this webinar will be available on our ecolab.com website next week sometime. And I also did want to put out a reminder that we do have another webinar that is scheduled for Tuesday, October 17th around rodents. Information will be coming out later in the month about how you can register, but just continue to visit ecolab.com to see when our next pest elimination webinar takes place. So thank you for your time.